I'm John Bennett, and it's a real delight to see you all here and to welcome you here today. I think we have a very, very special treat in store for us this afternoon. I say that because as I think about the next couple of hours, it represents to me an opportunity to listen to some very smart people talking about really great work that they're doing in our world. And that, for me, is an invigorating prospect. So thanks for being with us. And to move things right along, I want to introduce and welcome the Executive Director of the Aspen Community Foundation, Tamara Tormolin.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for being here. We all know that this place is extra special in the summer, and that we all have to choose between an endless array of activities and opportunities. And a lot of those activities are any of us participating and supporting in nonprofit cause-related events. And we do that as a provider, and we do that as a donor, and many of us, or most of us, do that as both. And we also have experienced this summer, so it makes it a very busy place. And along with that, we experienced a tremendous outpouring of support for the fires in Basalt and El Jebel. And that has kept us all really busy. So I think it's even more meaningful that you have all taken the time today to come here and listen to some keynote speakers and panelists and guests that we have, and to maybe take some time to pause and reflect about what we do, what our work is, and why we do it, and maybe most importantly, how we do it. We have missions to fulfill, we have goals, and we have desires to build community, and we serve. And so all of us in this room today are part of the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, and it's just a moment to pause and think, what's our role in that? And to maybe think about how we are a community in this room today. So thank you for being here. And Barbara Gold is our wonderful, fabulous board chair, and she's going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Now I have the pleasure, thank you, Tamara, and privilege to introduce Dr. Michael McAfee, the president of PolicyLink. In his role as president of PolicyLink, Dr. McAfee oversees strategy development and the achievement of policy wins that ensure all people in America have economic security, live in healthy communities of opportunity, and benefit from a just society. He came to PolicyLink in 2011 as the inaugural director of the Promise Neighborhoods Institute at PolicyLink. Under his leadership, PolicyLink emerged as a national leader in building cradle-to-career systems that ensure children and youth in our nation's most distressed communities have a pathway into the middle class. His partnership with local leaders in more than 60 communities contributed to significant improvements in the educational and developmental outcomes for more than 300,000 children, and helped attract public and private investment that exceed $1 billion. Because of the focus on results, Promise Neighborhoods became a permanent federal program through the 2015 authorization of the Every Student Succeeds Act. His vocation is to achieve equity in America, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And I give you, Dr. McAfee, what it takes achieving population-level results for the youth we're serving.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here today because I feel like I am home whenever I'm among community foundation leaders in the nonprofit community. This is how I started my career at a community foundation. when I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, a woman named Jan Kramer picked me up out of obscurity and showed me the power and potential of philanthropy. So this is how I got my career started, listening to donors try to build Kansas City and make it a world-class city. And so this is a special place in my heart for the Community Foundation and the donors and the folks that receive their investments. But it's also how I learned to think civically and to think about what does a moment need from its leaders. So that's what I'm going to talk to you today about. I'm not going to talk to you about what you ought to do, because I think every leader needs to find that for themselves. I'm going to tell you my journey. I'm going to tell you what I'm learning about trying to get population level results, because you all are the pros in this community. You know what this community needs. You've been doing amazing work. And so kudos to you for doing that. And you've taken on something really powerful, which I think is the next iteration of place-based work, this notion of cradle-to-career work. So I'm going to try to link some of this together. But before I do, it's important to know a little bit just about my background, because that's what I'm bringing to this conversation, so that you have a little way of processing what I'm saying, because sometimes people will listen and be like, why the hell did he say that? So I'm coming from a background of coming out of poverty myself. And still, you know, when I go home, my sisters didn't make it out, and I did. Some of you all heard me talk about my nephews getting out of detention in September after 2.5 years in the detention center. He's 16. So I have a front row seat on what it looks like when the nation has randomized opportunity. And so I bring some anger and contempt for systems that are hostile, for us not having clear pathways out of poverty. So I'm holding that. I'm holding the discipline of actually spending 8 years in the military, in the United States Army, having worked at a foundation, running a nonprofit youth development intermediary, spending 11 years at the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, and now running a public policy shop. I'm sharing that to say I've seen a lot, and I'm still on the road about 60% of the time around the country. So right now it's especially important because I see a lot of the nation, whether it's rural Appalachia like Berea, Kentucky, or Indianola, Mississippi in the Delta, or big cities or suburbs. And so that's the background that I'm bringing to this conversation. And so I want to start with that background by thinking about, what does the person need to bring to do the work of this moment? I think the most fundamental thing leaders can do is to be clear about, what does this moment require of our leadership? And that is very important to me, because it's easy to get seduced into just showing up. And before you know it, you don't realize you've just been showing up. And here's what I mean by showing up. When I think about PolicyLink and our work, I could fly around the country, I could write reports, I could give speeches, I could hold conferences, I could do technical assistance workshops, and I could do communities of practice. And that doesn't necessarily help me answer the fundamental question, is anyone better off? And so I'm really clear about why I'm showing up and what I want to accomplish, because the seduction in this work is dangerous. And the seduction is dangerous because we're doing a couple of things right now that, if we're not clear, becomes really bad practice. We're looking at population level data, and then we design stuff that is so feckless. I wonder why we even looked at the data in the first place. And this is an important point. Why look at the data if you don't have the heart and the stomach to want to do the work? Because what you end up doing is setting a mindset in your community that somehow, if we keep looking at it, and somehow if we keep talking about it, things are going to get better. And that's not what's happening. So what I try to do is decouple charity from transformative work. People told me to stop using charity. I was in Silicon Valley at a dinner at a wealthy donor's house, and I was talking, and I could see his face getting red. And he came up to me afterwards and said, "You really pissed me off." And it's like, why? He says, "Because you made me think about all the stuff that I was doing in a different way." And we had a really good conversation. So instead of charity now, I use like safety net supports or opportunity supports, because that work is important and it's essential. But it doesn't necessarily lead to transforming the systems and policies that are oppressing people. Does that make sense? Here's what I mean by that. Charity work means You give folks like me an opportunity. I get out of poverty and everyone else stays. It's random, it's not systemic, doesn't get to the root causes of things that are happening. It's triage, it has its place, so don't get me wrong, no critique of that. And we should do that, and we should be clear about what that infrastructure is and how do we do it really, really well. But don't put the burden on the backs of nonprofit leaders and families doing charity work and think it's going to get your numbers going in a different direction, because it won't necessarily correlate. That's what I'm asking you to consider. If you do that work, absolutely do it, and do it with quality and accept it for what it is. It's good work. But the transformative work that has to happen helps us reverse the cycle of what's hurting folks. I'll give you a good example. If you do financial security work, asset building work, that's something that is really popular right now. We help people get banked, we help them get good credit scores, we help them buy homes. That work is taken off, people are funding it all over the country. But if you're doing that work, I consider that to be charity work. I consider it to be charity work because at the same time that you're doing that work in poor communities, municipalities across the country are choosing to over-police communities to finance their municipality. So at the same time you're getting people banked and getting their credit scores up and helping them have a good life, the municipality is making a decision to say, you know what? I'm going to set up more traffic stops and things over here because I know those folks don't have the resources to fight back. And so before you know it, a $1,000 fine becomes $5,000, $10,000. That's undercutting all your wealth building, asset building work. That is an example of good charity work running smack dab into structural systems that are intentionally designed to oppress. You take any issue and you'll find that thing happening all over the country. If you want to know a really good example of it, look at the Department of Justice report on Ferguson. It lays out an exotic design of how one community chose to say, you know what, we'll go to this neighborhood and we'll extract fees to finance our municipality, and this is what it looks like. I'm sharing that with you because so many of you in this room are really smart investors. And it's really frustrating when you're trying to get results and you're being results-based, and just across town, folks are doing stuff to undercut that. And so in this moment, we've got to be clear that we can hold it all. So in my person, I'm holding being clear about what is good safety net support work that I must do in communities to help folks, and what is the transformative work that has to happen simultaneously. That's what I'm holding. I'm also holding that in my role, I need to transcend my role. My role is an HR function, nothing more, nothing less. That's how I choose to see it. So even before I became president and CEO of PolicyLink, that's how I acted. Long before I got to PolicyLink. And here's why that's important. Each and every one of you have a set of gifts that are an expression of your humanity, and it's got to come out. And you should never let someone box you into your cubicle because of a job title. The world needs your vocation to be expressed to heal the world. And you're not going to heal it because someone calls you the president and CEO. That doesn't mean anything from where I come from. What matters is, what will I do with the gift of this position to help folks? And what I mean by that is, when I show up, whether I'm at the White House or Congress, I need to be clear about who I represent. And I'm frustrated often because so many folks that I'm around have spent a lifetime chasing getting there, getting that title. And then they get there and they're afraid to say what needs to be said. They're afraid to do what needs to be done. They'll sit right in the White House in meetings. President, staff have asked a question. Instead of answering, they gave an answer where you don't even know what they said. And then they'll go to the parking lot and say what they really meant. That's not leadership, folks. When people are seeking the right advice and counsel, we need to be willing to give it. And we need to be fearless and be able to let people sit with the discomfort of their response to it. So when I show up in my role, I'm showing up not to worry about how people are going to experience my energy. I'm going to tell you what needs to be told. I'm going to tell you what the work is. And I'm going to let you sit with the discomfort of that, just like I have to sit with the discomfort of it. And this is an important way we have to think, folks, because we're not holding the interest of populations. For me, in PolicyLink, the population is the 100 million living at 200% of poverty. So when I show up, I'm not representing PolicyLink. I'm not representing my own interest. I'm representing what does the 100 million living at 200% of poverty need me to do right now, given the privilege that I have to be at PolicyLink. That's a third of this nation. And so when you think about a third of our nation living in or near poverty, you can see why I'm telling you, doing good one-off things only means that 100 million is going to become 120 and 150 before you know it. We're never going to get out in front of that number. So for me, I'm clear about what the population is. Who do I serve? I serve the 100 million. Now, there is a sanction for it. Sometimes you will get fired. I got ran out of Kansas City for talking about the population. That's where I also learned not to be afraid anymore. Because I've been out in poverty, I ain't going back, but at least I know how to survive in it. So I ought to be able to step into a role and not have to worry about it. I'm telling you that because if you think we're going to change these systems without pushback, this is the wrong profession for you. We do need to be respectful, but we need to be disruptive. And the disruption needs to have front and center, what are the needs of the population? 100 million at PolicyLink. Imagine that stress that puts on us now, really good stress. What that means is we can't just be comfortable writing reports, going around the country giving speeches and providing units of technical assistance. We need to be thinking about what's the next generation of good public policy that's going to usher in a new middle class, just like what we did in the 40s and 50s and 60s with the white middle class. And that means we're going to be cutting against the grain because at the very time we need effective public policy, in many cases we're choosing to defund governments so that they can't do this work. We're choosing to put all the pressure on nonprofits to fill in for government, which will never happen. We're putting the pressure on individual donors to have to pick up the slack, which is grossly unfair. So to me, who do I serve? That population. Now, what does that mean for children and families? It means in this moment, we've got to see entire systems. We've got to see entire systems, and we've got to hold children and their families the same way we hold children and families in our own house. You don't just do really good, high-quality kindergarten and say, I'll see you when you get to school. We have a fragmented infrastructure that does really good work at a particular developmental stage and then leaves the kids hanging at the rest of those developmental stages. And the crazy part of it is then we'll turn around and say, well, what happened to the kids? Well, you had good kindergarten, early learning infrastructure, no elementary infrastructure, insufficient middle school infrastructure, and you left them to survive on their own in high school. And then we wonder why graduation rates plummet, even though we did all that good work. So in this moment, the cradle to career work that you're undertaking is so important because it is actually the next generation of what we've learned over the last 60 years. And where you want to get in this community is, can you actually articulate what that system looks like? I use the supply chain literature because I can't find an analog in our literature. So just like with a supply chain, you can articulate it from start to finish. You can articulate the quality controls. You can articulate who does what. In this community, when you talk about cradle to career, can you articulate that pathway of opportunity? Can you articulate the quality controls? Who does the handoffs for children after all the early learning work into school? Who's doing that? How do we know that they're doing it well? What do they need to do it well? That's the next generation. Now here's the disruption. It means we don't necessarily need 10,000, 20,000 nonprofits. What it means is we need an effective system that is actually going to create opportunity for folks. And then we need to capitalize the executives appropriately so that they can do that work. That is really disruptive But if you think about our sector, we actually haven't changed the nonprofit infrastructure in many, many years. It's still a charity infrastructure. And we get fancy and we keep trying to change the names of things that we're doing. But that's just maintaining the status of management consultants. The work is still the same, folks. The work hasn't changed. So in this moment, it's an opportunity for us to join with these nonprofit executives, those of you in this room who have launched really good work around building up early learning supports and other supports at every developmental stage. Now it's time for you to really ask for a return on that investment by making sure that that system is there for these children from the time they're conceived to the time they can get into the workforce and compete for a living wage job. That's what this moment is. That's the work we've been doing at the Promised Neighborhoods Institute over the last 8 years. And you're starting to see people take off. Nonprofit executives are actually redesigning what their infrastructure looks like. They're not leaving it to other people to do it. So if you go to the north side of Minnesota, they can actually tell you the nonprofit executives came together and said, this is what our infrastructure looks like. And you know what? Don't fund anything else unless you're funding this infrastructure and hold us accountable for delivering. But this is what is needed to help children. That's a radical departure. It's a radical departure from waiting for a donor or a foundation to say, if you do X, I'll give you some money. They took the lead on saying, if you want these results, this is how we have to be organized. These are the nonprofits that will be funded. This is the suite of public policy that must be changed. And then they've set about doing that work. Now, here's also what I'm learning about this work. If you don't want to do this work, and you find that people are saying that they do, it is time to be still. It is time to be still and stop talking, stop getting fancy, and for folks to deal with why they are choosing to avoid the work. Here's what I mean by that. Either you're going to do it or you're not. You're not going to back into it. You're not going to finesse your way into it. There's not going to be a fancy word that's going to get everybody magically to want to do this. This is the work for our generation. And the reason why it's time for us to be still is because in our sector, when we avoid work, we generate a whole bunch of other activity to look busy. But it's to avoid accountability. So we'll start writing papers. We'll start bringing in folks from Harvard to tell us some more of what we already know. We'll start looking at our data again. We've already looked at it 1,000 times. But we're going to look at it again and slice it a different way, do it with a different graph or chart or something like that. You don't need to do any of that anymore. You need to sit still and decide, where is the heart to do what is required to unleash the next wave of opportunity at a scale unseen in this nation for many, many years. That's this moment. And you'd be surprised how comfortable it gets when people get still and you say, don't write another thing. Don't push another piece of paper. Look each other in the eye and decide if this is what you want to do. And the reason why I say that is because I've been in too many rooms where I see deals get done over a darn napkin or a lot less. So I know when leaders, folks who have agency and folks who have power want to do stuff, they don't need 5 reports. They don't need 5 years. They don't need 50 consultants. They do it. So what I'm asking you is to acknowledge there is a way that we behave in this room when we want to exercise our power. There's a way we behave. But there's also a way we behave when we want to avoid it. And it's time for us to squeeze that out of our system in this sector and to be maximally accountable. That's the discomfort. To think about, what would it mean for me to join my fate with others to actually achieve scale? When you hear me talking about scale, I'm talking about 51% of a population that needs it getting the supports that they need. It's not a magical number. It's just a number that we used in Promised Neighborhoods because it was tough enough that when you started trying to get there, you had to let go of everything you were doing. You had to let it go and do something different. So when you think about scale, I want you to think about, what is your number? think I saw a number, you guys got about 3,000 children here, 88,000 total population. You've got a scale here where you could lead the nation and show the nation how to do this work. The scale is right here. Your leadership is right here. You've got the underpinnings of great work going on in the relationships to do this. I think if this is going to happen, it's going to happen in the smaller cities first because you got the scale to do the work. You got the relationships with each other to do the work. That's why I'm just trying to lay out markers of what I'm seeing and how I'm holding my role. You'll figure out how to do it here. But you've got a scale where you can actually articulate what would be our cradle to career infrastructure. What would be our quality controls? You already got good measures of results. Now, what does it take for us to hold each other accountable to do that? That's transformative work. That's this moment. The only game in town left is results at scale. That's it. It's like a business saying, what's the new market for us? This is it. We are at an evolutionary stage where all the easy stuff has been done, unfortunately. We're not going to finesse our way out of this. We're not going to talk our way out of it. We're going to have to link faiths and do the work. The work is scale. The work is systems work, and the work is policy work. What is that suite of public policies in this region that would usher in opportunity? Now, the last thing I'm going to say before we take questions, because I really want to just talk to you in a dialogue, is I want you to think about systems. Systems are important to me because folks can choose to lead without taking up any more money. Systems work means, for the most part, leaders can choose how they behave. I can choose to have a policy link that hurts people, or I can choose not to. I can actually make that decision today. I can choose to have a policy link that is inclusive or exclusionary. I can choose to do that today. And in too many cases, we're letting leaders off the hook for running systems that are hostile to people. And it's time for us to hold leaders accountable for doing their darn jobs, to stop hurting people. Here's what I mean by that. At PolicyLink, we're all about equity. We look like the United Nations, but yet we still don't have it right. I can walk through that organization and I can choose to say, who am I not seeing? Where do we recruit for Native Americans? Where do we recruit for folks who don't have college degrees? Where do I recruit for rural white folks? Where would I recruit for that? Right now, we recruit at the best schools in the universities. The best universities in the country, which means I'm leaving out a whole lot of talent. That means I'm not as equitable as I would like to think we are. So before I go tell other people what they ought to do, there's some work that I can do there. That is an example of me making PolicyLink more equitable. I can decide if folks take leave because they got to take care of their families, do they get punished for that? Or do they not? I can make those decisions. I can make those decisions around when folks call us for help. Do we blow them off if there's not a grant associated with it, or do we find a way to still share our knowledge to folks? I can choose to have a culture that will be responsive to folks in this country. Think about health departments. Think about police departments. Think about all the things that we could do to make those systems less hostile if leaders chose to take up their role differently. So before you think about money, to me, the innovation comes from now. Leaders choosing to just behave differently first and foremost. Because if you're not going to behave differently, money ain't going to help solve this problem. Your heart must want to express your humanity, folks. It has to. That is not soft language. That is powerful language. But this is not a money problem. Money's needed, but that comes later. This is a moment for you to get clear in your head about what you want to do and have a calm heart to do the work. That's what I'm finding in my journey. Because when I'm in that place, a lot of things can happen. And now what you hear me describing, and the last thing I'll say is, the radical imagination that is necessary to make sure that this stays a great nation. You see right now, there's a crisis of institutional quality. It didn't start with the administration that we have. So I don't want to let folks off the hook by projecting into that like somehow that's the problem. We forgot and lost our way a long time ago as institutions. I'm talking about progressive institutions, even before we get to anything else. We lost our way. And let me show you how we lost our way. I can't tell you how many places I go where people look at data. The data says poor whites, poor black folks, poor brown folks, poor Asians are hurting. And then they'll say to me, Michael, I would love for you to come and talk about our new data report, but there's just one thing. Don't say anything about race. Well, what the hell? We can't even do any work, right? Think about that though, folks. You've just told me you want to avoid work. So why would you expect things to change if you're afraid to even call out the names of the very people who you say you want to help? Well, on the other side, right now, I see a leader who chooses to tell you who he cares about, puts it front and center and stands up for it, fights for it. And I'm standing there saying, wow, it's amazing that I have to take a negative experience to find a model of what courageous leadership looks like. That's really tragic, folks. But it's true. Because on this side of the house, so many of us have been spending years denying the population that we say we're going to serve. How can you invite me into a community to talk about improving outcomes if you won't even call out the people? And where I'm at right now is, yes, some people may be uncomfortable talking about race and economic inequality and class structure and all that, but I can no longer worry about making everybody comfortable. Because you know, right now, this administration ain't trying to make me comfortable. It's not even top of mind. I'm tired of waiting for that moment where everybody's going to be so comfortable we can actually do the work. That ain't happening. That's why I'm showing up this way. It's time to work with those who are comfortable enough to get started. And it doesn't mean we don't bring people along. It doesn't mean we demonize folks. It doesn't mean that we judge them. What it means is we start modeling the way forward for this generation, for our sector, for the work that we care about, where we say we're not going to let it be held hostage. Because for you to want to talk about race, that's got to be your own personal journey for you to get comfortable with. I'm not going to make you comfortable with it. For you to want to talk about class, that's got to be your journey. I'm not going to make you comfortable with that. So while I'm waiting, I'm not even guaranteed that you're going to do your own work. So this is an exciting time for us because we can let go of all the stuff that's gotten in the way. And we can just ask ourselves, who do we choose to serve? What do we choose to do collectively? And how will we measure progress? And we can sit still until people agree to align their contributions around what we've just declared. That's how simple and elegant it is and how hard it is at the same time. Imagine if you came into a room and you saw the population, you saw the result, and you saw the measure of progress, and you waited for the contributions. No more paper. No more finessing. Align the contribution for transformative impact. That's the opportunity. Because when you do that, when you extend that invitation, watch people do more than they're already doing. When you create that culture of accountability, watch what it unleashes. Every last one of you came to this work to get results. I'm just having a results-based conversation with you right now about what does it take from what my vantage point for me to deliver on the promise of coming to this work and not wanting to sell myself out by making a nice salary and then just dialing it in. I don't want to dial it in. But what I also know is I can't do this work by myself. So while I hate collaboration and I hate process, I must submit to it. I must submit to it because anything worth doing right now is going to be too big for any individual or any institution. And that's why I'm giving you that container, population result indicator. Because if I have that, then I can hold myself in control. Without that discipline, I don't know what we're going to get. So as I close here, I want you to think about something. What will it take for you to manifest radical imagination in your work? What would it take for you to manifest your humanity in your work? What would it take for you to not be afraid and to just call it like it is without hurting other folks, without being disrespectful, but also not worrying about if someone's discomfort? You will be uncomfortable in this work if you're doing it. I'm uncomfortable all the time. And the reason why I'm uncomfortable is because, you know, when I worked at the foundation, I had a great mentor who showed me a lot about how I had to show up as an African-American man. There was time when she'd say, Michael, we're going to talk to a donor, and you're not used to talking to folks like you, so you're not going. And there'd be other times she'd help me understand the politics of how my person impacts people. Those are great gifts if you can find someone who will be vulnerable enough to help coach you and share that. I got that gift from Jan Kramer. But I'm sharing that with you to say, in this moment, being uncomfortable is our job. Being uncomfortable is our job. We're going to be uncomfortable because you're going to be pushing people to let go of mindsets that they've held for many years that just don't serve the results. You're going to be challenging relationships that you've had for years because they don't serve the results. You're going to be challenging your heart because you've been wedded to something that doesn't serve the result for this moment. I find it painful and liberating at the same time. But it is tough work. But just think about the privilege we all have in this room. Think about the beautiful relationships you have. Think about the beautiful legacy of what you've already built. I'm standing here because of all the work that you all have done over the years, the pathways to opportunities that you've created, the spaces that you've opened up for folks like me to be able to step into. And what you hear me saying in my journey, I don't want to squander the gift that you've given me. I don't want to squander that gift because you didn't have to give it. You didn't have to give it. And the only way I can honor it right now is to do the unfinished business for this nation, to create equity, to create a just society where everyone can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So thank you. So there's a couple of mics, and we'll take some questions. There's a question up front. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think in relation to one of the promised neighborhoods, you said that when you sat still and looked at and thought about what you all were going to do, you noticed, or you decided you had to come up with a different way, different approach. Can you talk about that a little bit? What was different? What did you change?
Yes. So the first thing that changed was, oftentimes we try to solve major social problems programmatically. And programs have a place, but we needed to hold the entire complexity of the solutions that need to be brought to bear. Families owning a contribution for creating their own pathway and getting out. Nonprofits implementing high quality, good programming. Systems changes and policy changes. In the old way, we would put all this on the backs of a nonprofit and say, hey, my program is going to reverse the cycle of generational poverty. That's a lie. It ain't happening. And so what we end up doing is punishing nonprofits for the numbers not moving, and we've never done anything with the oppressive policy structure, the oppressive system structure, and rarely have we really invited families to own a part of this as well. So to me, personal responsibility is not a conservative thing. Everybody needs to own in this result. And so that's what I meant. So the first thing was to shift the nonprofit executives in the federal government's way they thought about problem solving. What's the right mix of solutions for a particular problem? Don't just put it all on the nonprofit. Don't just put it all on a family member, because those are the two easiest places to scapegoat. Those lazy folks over there, they don't want to do anything. Those nonprofits, they just aren't disciplined enough. They're so unsophisticated, the things that we say about them. That's not true. So the first thing was to say, can you hold the right mix of solutions? The next is to say, can you work at a scale never achieved before? because the numbers aren't going to change unless you do statistically significant work. And for folks to get in the room to say, man, you mean you're telling me just don't run my pet project anymore? That I actually have to think about working with the Department of Human Services? You mean to tell me I actually got to work with the, yes. That's hard stuff, folks. Because in many cases, there's a lot of hurt feelings and damaged relationships in communities from institution to institution. So that was the difference. They had to hold the interests of entire populations, even from where they sat, where they may be working with 2,000 kids. But they had a piece of it. They had to be willing to hold the entire complexity of the mix of solutions. That's where we're at now. Thinking about families, programs, policies, and systems, and thinking about how do you join when you hold a piece of it, but not all of it. And then how do you, what Heifetz at Harvard calls, do the adaptive work? How do you actually do the messy work of getting in relationship when you don't have to, right? I mean, that's tough stuff, folks, because not a lot of us in this room knows what it feels like when we don't have to listen to somebody. Or you don't actually have any agency or power to make people do something. John Gardner in On Leadership calls that exercising non-jurisdictional leadership. I think that's one of the most powerful skills you can have today. So you can imagine getting folks in a room who haven't had to exercise those muscles of exercising that leadership, having these tough conversations, who simply avoided each other. That was what they had to work through. Technically, can they lay out the right results frame? But technical work is only the part of it. The real work is adaptive. When I say adaptive work, it means we actually don't know how to get there. We're going to get there by being in relationship with each other and figuring it out. That's the adaptive work. Now, the last thing I'll say here, this also had implications for philanthropy and government. What it meant is, you need to, if you're going to ask people to do adaptive work, they got to have adaptive capital. You telling people to write you these exotic grant proposals and can't change them simply means you've taken away learning. Simply means you've taken away their ability to craft emergent strategy. So the bottom line for them was either you trust the management team or you don't. Say that. Because the moment you start squeezing them to fit into a tight little grant making or investor box is the moment you're now running counter to the results. So adaptive work requires adaptive capital. Either you trust the management team to find a way to start learning how to get results at a bigger scale, or you don't. That's not a foreign concept. Business operates that way all the time. So that's what we've learned. Is that helpful? Yep. Cool. Other questions? And then there's one there. Yes, sir.
So you've talked a bunch about nonprofits and government work, but I'm curious what you see as a role for business in supporting transformative change in the way you've discussed.
Perfect. So we recently started a new body of work at PolicyLink called the Corporate Racial Equity Advantage, because what we're finding, businesses are doing some amazing work. Many of them are starting to understand the demographic changes. By 2044, the nation is going to be a nation of color. In many cases, that's already happening. You look at places like California, the majority of kids being born now are of color. They're starting to create new markets. PayPal, for example, decided that, you know what? Some of our vendors are struggling to find access to capital. They decided we're going to scrap our traditional way of doing it. We're going to take sales volume and some other things. They created a whole new market that really helped people of color. Billion-dollar business now. You see my point? So what they're realizing is there is a competitive advantage. All that stuff that Michael Porter was talking about years ago in the competitive advantage of the inner city, there is a competitive advantage for figuring out how to see populations of color not as just charity, but as central to your value chain. And so that is an example. But business also can use its voice, folks. One of the most powerful things that happen in Promised Neighborhoods is the George Kaiser Family Foundation in Tulsa called us up one day and said, how can I be of support? And we said, well, Mr. Kaiser, you know, we're trying to make Promised Neighborhoods permanent, and the best thing you can do is unleash your Republican lobbying firm on DC for us. That's what he did. Didn't need a grant. I just needed him to deploy those resources. That's what actually helped get Senator Mitch McConnell to stand down and Senator Thad Cochran in Mississippi to stand down on Promised Neighborhoods. Helped us make that a permanently authorized program, even though it was a contentious, politically charged environment. So we can get results in any condition if we do the right work. That's how business can help. But business can also use its voice and its civic leadership muscle to start commanding institutions and systems stop hurting folks. I mean, what's happening in Flint as an example is atrocious. That is an example. Businesses can say something about that and it would change like that. When business talks, people listen. If you're going to wait for the nonprofits to have to keep making a case for it, we'll be waiting for 20 years. Think about how many people are going to be poisoned with lead by then. You see my point? And then you'll issue another report to talk about children in lead-based paint or lead in the water. You see them? It's crazy what we do. So we need businesses' voice. But we also need businesses to stop being extractive as well. I mean, think about what's happened with Wells Fargo just over the last 6 months. And I'm sharing that not to beat up on Wells Fargo, but Wells Fargo shouldn't have to have an ad campaign in this day and age to say we're going to recommit ourselves. Because hell, what were you doing in the first place? And this is my point. If you want to be destructive and extractive, stop bullshitting and call it. But own what it causes in community. That's my point. If you want to behave that way, then cool. If you want to just say capitalism is just going to run roughshod over community, then great. Then we'll just have a nation where it becomes too toxic for everybody. Because where I live, it's actually not the poor people who are complaining. They know how to survive. They're going to be all right. It's the middle class folks at Facebook, Salesforce, and others that says, you know what? You've actually created a society that I can't even live in now. I can't afford that beautiful San Francisco downtown. I can't even afford downtown Oakland. You know why you can't afford it? Because in the 70s, we walked away from public education and said it was for those people. Now you want to move downtown, you got to decide, do I pay for private schooling or that nice condo or apartment? Because I can't pay for both because it costs a minimum of $5,000 for a really nice place in the Bay Area. The reality is also, there's only about 3 counties in the nation where a person working a minimum wage job can live without being cost burdened. So think about that. So when you think about what that means to the employees of a company, this society is too toxic. Before we get to talking about poor people, it's too toxic for the middle class now. And the danger with the middle class is they make $1 too much to get any support. But this is the world that we've created. So my point to people is this. I'm all for capitalism and I'm all for making it work better. But I also want people to own the things that they choose to do. If you want to be extractive, be extractive. Stop acting like you're not. And then don't be apologetic for it. Don't say we're going to be recommit. Just say, hell, my bad, we got caught. I'll do it again tomorrow. That's my point. Be man and a woman enough to own what you're doing. This is the moment that we're in, folks. Let's stop playing games. So what business can do is to find that way to still participate in capitalism, but not have to be destructive. That's all I'm asking. Participate. Let's not damage communities so then your foundation side of the house has to clean that up. Because in some cases, you can't clean it up. And the last point I'll make on this is this. You want to talk about the biggest stripping of wealth from communities of color and poor white folks in America. It actually happened under President Obama's watch with what happened with the housing crisis. And I was so mad by that because we sat back and never called out the big banks who got bailed out, but we're playing all these games with people trying to process their loans or refinance them or renegotiate them. Go look at all the postmortem reports that have been done now about how they behaved. So this is an example where on one side of the house, you're just stripping wealth out of communities. Then on the other side of the house, you have your foundation talking about how do we build a community. Well, hell, you just used the most powerful tool to strip wealth. What's the point now? Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to get people to think about is you can't have it both ways in this nation right now. You gotta decide the type of nation you wanna build. And you gotta be man and woman enough then to stand on it. That's all I'm asking. Can we do that? That's where business can help us. Business can help us call it. And business can help us usher in the next generation of innovations that have us being less extractive and more opportunity-based. So I think that's a beautiful thing, and I think the more we can figure out how to work with business and partner more deeply, I think we're going to find the next generation of what capitalism should look like in America. Is that helpful? Cool. There was another question, yes.
Can you give us an example of one of the promised neighborhoods or the projects that you did that really worked well?
Perfect.
And why it worked well?
Yes. I'll take Indianola, Mississippi as an easy example. We have an indicator that talks about children having access to a primary care physician as an example. And in many cases, you know, folks were trying to cook up all these fancy ways that they were going to do this. They stopped and actually looked at the system to say, what does the system look like? Meaning, where the hell are kids going right now? Basic stuff. They actually stopped for a moment and said, you know what, I'm not going to lead with cooking up a new program first because I'm trying to sell myself to get a grant. They said, where are children going? They discovered that there were actually 2 medical systems where more than 80% of the kids were going to. So all they actually really needed to do was partner with business, educate those doctors on how to look for particular things around child well-being, toxic stress, and other things. That solved their problem. They didn't actually need to create a new system. And they needed to get kids enrolled in those facilities, and they needed to pass some state legislation to help increase the slots that they had for kids who didn't have access to health care. Does that make sense? That wasn't a simple one. Another one is around in the Northside Achievement Zone in Minneapolis, reversing the summer slide. They actually re-engineered their entire system. You know, the summer slide is when kids start doing really good in school or whatever, but then the summertime, there's nothing for them, so they regress back. We're talking about reading, math, things like that. They re-engineered their entire system so that kids stayed in school the entire summer. They still had their recreational activities and all that, but they actually built out that portion of their pipeline. So now today what they can tell you is that children who are going to the Northside Achievement Zones are 2.5 times more likely to be at level when it comes to reading and math proficiency. That's huge. That's happened in 5 years. That's big. So those are examples where folks didn't actually have to cook up a new program. They actually needed to redesign what they already had so that it actually worked for families. Again, this is not a foreign concept. Porsche dealership does it for me all the time. They care about my user experience. They always asking me, what do I want? Did I enjoy that experience as well? We don't ask families and folks what they want. So often, so much of what we design doesn't work simply because it has no correlation to how people live their lives. So the biggest way we started accelerating results, we're asking folks, what do you need? Another example is in San Antonio, Texas, around reading, getting kids, families to start having a college-going culture. The nonprofits were sitting in the room, kvetching about why parents weren't showing up and what's going on and they can't figure it out. Some community person said, well, why don't you ask the grandparents or the other carers for these children what they would like? They did that. They started a campaign, a contest, for the carers, mostly grandmothers, to start taking pictures of the learning spaces they were creating in their homes. Now, this is a real systems and scaling strategy, because you can imagine how competitive that got. They started coming to the community meetings now with their pictures of the learning space in their home. Now, for many of them, this is the first time the kids had a place to think about learning and reading in a household. That's huge. And then the nonprofit provider started talking to those grandparents about toxic stress. All the work from Dr. Jack Shankoff from Harvard Center for the Developing Child, or Dr. Nadine Burke's work. So then they could go to work bringing their expertise to help those grandparents get far more sophisticated about how to help their babies. They're increasing reading levels now. But that was another example where the nonprofits actually got in service of the parents. Instead of saying, let me go cook up something and bring it to you. They didn't cook up something. They said, you know what, let me get in service of what you're trying to do. We had simply never tapped that brilliance in community. We just kept cooking up stuff and getting mad because folks weren't coming. And then they were able to turn on their expertise and give it to those parents. So those are examples of what we're seeing happen. The last example I'll give you is in California. Well, California had a really bad problem. There's like 5 promised neighborhoods in California. They had a really bad problem with kicking kids out of kindergarten for what they call willful defiance. I don't know how you're willfully defiant when you're that little. I mean, that means basically if you're running around or if somebody's afraid of you, they can say you're being willfully defiant and kick you out of school. So on this side of the house, all these providers are doing really good work to try to get kids ready and proficient, and the system is hostile to the kids. They actually had to band together and go to the state to pass restorative justice legislation signed by the governor to stop folks from doing that. Now, here's a more powerful example of how that played out in the Northside Achievement Zone. The superintendent at that time simply said, you know what? I already have the power. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop kicking kids out of school. I'm going to make a decision for every child that is up for expulsion. That's how we're going to fix it. So imagine it stopped pretty quickly. Now think about those solutions. That didn't require a lot of money. The advocacy work was already going on in the state. Writing a bill is not that expensive. Organizing our networks to fight for it is not crazy expensive. Getting a superintendent to do her darn job and say, my system will not hurt children, is not a radical thing. Those of us with buying options, that's what we expect when we pay for our kids to go somewhere. That's not foreign to us. So those are examples where folks had to stop thinking in an old way and to start being in relationship with people differently, start actually seeing people in community as having value for solving their own problems, and actually having to understand that, you know what, I actually can't get my result programmatically until I deal with the hostile system and policy structures. Even if I'm not doing that work, my good programmatic work should be informing the work of advocates so that we can change those systems. Helpful? Cool. Do we have time for one more before we go? Thanks for your time.